Hello everybody, this is Peak Entertainment and we are back again, and we're now going to do a season overall review of the final season, the 7th season of Star Wars, The Clone Wars. Everybody, or most people, are familiar with this series and they know that it recently concluded with its epic 4-part Siege of Mandalore arc, but we're going to concentrate now on the overall episodes and where I think they went right and where I think they went wrong. So we're going to go into spoiler territory in this review. So you haven't seen any of the episodes, or you haven't indeed seen the final 4 episodes, I advise you to stop now, complete the series or the 7th season, and then come back to this review later on. You can also catch up on various reviews that I've done, particularly of the premiere episode and the final 4 episodes on my channel if you go to the various playlists or the links in the description below. So concentrating on the final season, I can remember when initially with Clone Wars, it had been a long running series going all the way back to 2008, and this was preceding a 2D animated show prior to that. And Clone Wars was famous, of course, for being this 3D, very photorealistic, stylized kind of Star Wars action show, as we all know, taking place in the events between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. And each episode was around about 22 episodes long. But what happened was, in the 6th season, they had kind of come to a halt and it stopped halfway through. I think it was 12 or 13 episodes, and I think they were called the Lost episodes or the Lost Stories. I think season 6 concluded. We had that Yoda-centric episode where he was kind of making more discoveries about the Force, and sadly there were no more episodes after that. And there was very much a question mark over the Clone Wars. Would it come back for any future episodes? How long would it go on for? Would we see a kind of final connection towards the events of Revenge of the Sith? So I think it was mainly through more fan perception and fans' insistence online that kind of propelled Disney or Lucasfilm to carry on with another extension of the series. And also, I think as well, it was also to provide more new content, fresh content, because at the time of the Disney Plus streaming service, they only really had The Mandalorian, because the MCU series, you know, the Falcon, Winter Soldier, Loki, WandaVision, they had only began production and they weren't due for release till later this year. And as we all know now, that's going to be further delayed due to the ongoing crisis at the moment. So I think that was also another motivation to why these episodes were produced forward. It was just provide more content for the Disney Plus, more new, fresh content. So in the end, we managed to get 12 episodes of the Clone Wars. They were already well into pre-development, and Disney managed to get them finished and released for this 7th season. So going into it overall, and if we look at the structure of the 7th season, it really comprises of 3 main arcs. We have the first arc, which is the Bad Batch. We have the second arc, which is the Martez sisters. And then the third arc, which I've of course mentioned before, was the Siege of Mandalore. So going forward here, the first arc, the Bad Batch, that was overall a really terrific run of episodes. It concentrated primarily on Rex, and he was leading a platoon to protect a kind of base that was under attack from the Separatists, and one of his companions called Echo was being put under some kind of mind control or experimentation, and they basically had to go in and rescue him. They enlisted the services or the help, if you like, of this rogue, very kind of out and out group of commandos called the Bad Batch. And yeah, it was a very action-packed, very exciting episode on here. We started off with Rex, but then we saw later the likes of Anakin, Obi-Wan and Mace Windu come into the storyline, and it was great action set pieces, like as we were accompanied with the Bad Batch and they were going through. We had these various amounts of set pieces as they're taking on droids and they're climbing across kind of various buildings and jumping across various landscapes, and it was all very great adventurism and escapism to watch, and animation and set pieces were actually outstanding on here. We then of course moved on to the Martez sisters, the very controversial arc, which I'll go into depth in a minute. This involved of course the return of Ahsoka, and she got involved with the Martez sisters, who were in trouble with the Pikes because they were basically caught up in various schemes and money making outfits, and this involved having the splice, of course, and they had to kind of bargain it with the Pikes, and they got involved in various misdemeanors and escapades throughout on air, and Ashoka was there to kind of help them out on it. The Siege of Mandalore we've covered many times in my own reviews. Of course, this was the concluding arc that involved Ahsoka teaming up with Bo-Katan and the rest of the Mandalore army as they wanted to wrestle control of Mandalore from Darth Maul, who we know had taken control of that in season 5. And this concluded as well, we saw later on, with the likes of Order 66 and how that affected Ahsoka and Rex, and we saw those events more from their perspective as we ventured really away from the Clone Wars, really knee deep into Revenge of the Sith, and we saw how those events played out from the point of view of Ahsoka and Rex, and kept ourselves more distance away from Obi-Wan and Anakin. The good elements of the show, as I mentioned before, was the animation and the action, and they really went all out, particularly in that final arc, to making this a real kind of cinematic standard experience on it. The animation, which to be fair has always been great in Clone Wars, but this 7th season in particular, it was so crisp and pristine, and the sequences and the battle scenes and the fight scenes and the lightsaber duels were all of a really stellar level. I mean, you really can't fault this. I've always mentioned before that the animation quality you'd expect to be high because it was Lucasfilm, because it was Star Wars. We're talking about one of the most successful, profitable IPs of all time. So you'd expect a high standard of graphics and details and stylized within the animation. And that was just double fold for this season. I thought it was really fantastic to look at. I really can't fault any episode in particular where the animation looked bad or was subpar. They really put a big effort into all 12 episodes throughout on it, as with the action and the set pieces and the voice work of everybody involved. In particular, I look at Sam Witwer as Darth Maul when we concentrate on the Siege of Mandalore. His performance was absolutely fantastic on here, as with all the other actors involved on it. You really can't fault the production of it. So the structure of the episodes itself. So the Bad Batch was particularly very exciting, and I mentioned before the Siege of Mandalore in particular. If we're going to highlight what was best about the season, it was that Siege of Mandalore. 4 parts, many have mentioned before. You could have condensed that story into making an own individual movie. It really is a standout, not only from this particular season, but I'd say also a highlight of the particular series. And many have commented, and I can agree, that this is some of the best Star Wars content that we've had recently. Certainly, I'd say within the last 5 years. I know many people have commented online within Twitter that they reckon that the Siege of Mandalore is the best content ever within Star Wars. Now, I wouldn't go that far. I would still put the original trilogy above anything else on here, and maybe Revenge of the Sith is just as good or better than what we've seen here. But if you were comparing to Star Wars Rebels or The Mandalorian or indeed the sequel trilogy, then yes, I would put the Clone Wars above that. Also the Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, I would put that last arc of the Siege of Mandalore, I would put that above those movies as well. Just really cinematic, just vivid, compelling storytelling, characterized, and great just visual action all the way through, intense imagination alike on it. I have to make a special mention for the music. I think it was Kevin Kyver, is that his name on here, the composer of the music? Really just outstanding. Lots of synthesized and really deep hones and tones to the musical score, particularly with the Siege of Mandalore. Again, I've mentioned in previous reviews, it gave that vibe, if you like, of some of the best science fiction movies in the last 5, 10, 11 years. Minority Report, Inception, Interstellar, District 9, really distinctive musical score out here, which adds to the experience as well. So that was all composed fantastically well on here. And as well, it was a Not maybe the complete ending with the finale episode, which I'll talk about more in a minute when I cover what didn't work as well this season. But overall, the ending was still sound, particularly the last couple of scenes that we saw on here. And I mentioned spoilers already, so it was a nice touch at the very end to see Darth Vader and the way that Darth Vader was rendered on here, particularly in that visual output that we said on the icy planet, showing him show up at the end. That was all fantastic to watch on there. So really, overall, visually and production wise, it was all outstanding to watch. You really can't fault the production levels that went into this movie. And again, it's going to be remarked, and I can agree, that you can't help but feeling had some of this effort been put more into the sequel trilogy. I'm talking much more about the characterization and the development and the progression of certain characters involved. You just wish that more effort had been put into the sequel trilogy that we saw in this Clone Wars here. And it's kind of, for me, just a bit of a tragedy that, people have really come out and celebrated the Clone Wars and this final arc in particular, and that we didn't get that same sort of reception for the sequel trilogy, because I think Star Wars has to move on forward as a franchise, right? Not necessarily the fault of Clone Wars, but if we look in particular of The Mandalorian, and that we're still going to get this Obi-Wan series whenever that comes about, and even the High Republic, all of this content is taking action in the past, and I want to see Star Wars move forward with the continuity, with new characters, new ideals, and new continuity, right? And we can't get there unless the new content is celebrated going forward. And I just wish the sequel trilogy had the same kind of effort and detail put into characterization and storytelling that we got, particularly in this last 4-part story arc that we had on of the Siege of Mandalore, which was terrific throughout. So I'm just going to go over the kind of more negative aspects of this season. And I mentioned before that we had a very much a 3 set story structure. So the Bad Batch, the Martez sisters, and the Siege of Mandalore. Now, unfortunately, the Bad Batch, and particularly the Martez sisters, there were episodes here that weren't needed, that weren't required, that weren't necessary, and they hurt the season in the long run. And I'm going to highlight particularly the Martez sisters arc. So basically, as I mentioned before, it was Ahsoka helping the Martez sisters escape from space pirates, right? Now, this arc easily could have been defined or closed out in one episode, where we basically catch up with Ahsoka. We get a couple of scenes showing what she's been up to since she left the Jedi Order at the end of season 5. She runs into the Martez sisters. We see that they're on the run from these pirates on here. They get captured. Ahsoka helps them escape. They're cornered, and then at the end we see Bo-Katan and her group of soldiers. They help out Ahsoka and the Martez sisters at the end, and then as a kind of payback, Ahsoka has to go away with Bo-Katan and her group to help them usurp Darth Maul, right? So boom, there you go. That could have been your easy standalone one episode of this arc, yet it got dragged out for 4 episodes, and it was such a repetitive beat of basically they go away, they get captured, they go away, they get captured. I think it was episode 7 or episode 8 where they basically start off in a jail cell, and at the end of the episode they end up in a jail cell as well. So there was literally zero development or zero progression in terms of the narrative or story, and it really hurt this season going forward, because you look at these episodes and I think, had we had one episode concentrating on Ahsoka and the Martez sisters, then that would have freed up 3 more episodes where we could have concentrated a lot more on other characters within the Clone Wars mythology. I've mentioned in previous reviews, and we've all noticed if you're into Star Wars, that there was a terrific concept and story arc of the Son of Dathomir, which concentrated on Darth Maul and what happened to him when we got captured, if you remember, in the episode The Lawless by Darth Sidious. What happened to him from that stage to when we saw him at the beginning of Old Friends Not Forgotten of the Siege of Mandalore arc, where we see him emerging from the tunnel. Okay, so as a viewer of Clone Wars, you're kind of thinking, what happened? How did he escape? And they don't really refer to that to the whole season. I think there's one scene in the Old Friends Not Forgotten episode where he basically mentions of the soldiers freeing him from the imprisonment, right? And we never refer to it again. So that would have been great for this story arc within this 7th season if we had more time to spend with Maul and where he'd got up to and what happened to him, instead of spending 4 episodes just wasted with the Martez sisters arc. Again, it just hurt the season in the long run, because you're watching that episode and again, this episode just seems to drag, not go anywhere, just very ponderous, nature alike. And Clone Wars has always been notorious of this. We've had various story arcs throughout the entire series where they just seem like filler, they're just padding out the season. We get 3-4 story arcs that could have been condensed into 1 episode or 2 episode maximum, and it just padded it out. But I think overall in Clone Wars, as you got later on into the season, we would get the more substantial, more serious story arcs. And even I mentioned the Bad Batch, was a terrific 4-part, but I really think the Bad Batch could have been done in 2 episodes maximum. It basically is just a rescue mission, and we see the effects of Echo being experimented on. That did not need to be 4 episodes long. Regardless of how well executed the action was in Bad Batch, again, that did not need to be as long as it was, and again, just took away time from other characters that we could have spent going forward within this season. I look at the likes of Asajj Ventress, or the Night Sisters, or Mace Windu, or Boba Fett. These are characters that were prominent throughout, particularly the latter seasons of Clone Wars, and that it would have been great just to touch base on them going out in this final season. I do know there's certain novelization and certain books that detail what happened to these characters, but I'm talking about perspective of the show. As a viewer of the Clone Wars, I want to see what happened to these characters. And a final season of any show, whether it's animated or live action, it should always have a summary of what happens to the most prominent characters within the show, and especially Asajj Ventress, which, as we all know, started off as a villain. She was kind of like the student of Count Dooku, but they kind of set up a more redemptive arc of Asajj Ventress, particularly in one episode called The Bounty, which was a terrific episode. And later on, as we saw, she was prominent in kind of helping Ahsoka when she was falsely accused of murder. So Asajj Ventress was turned out to be, quite a very compelling anti-hero to watch, and we never saw her again. So that's very unfortunate. And as we go on to the finale of the episode, as I mentioned in the finale review, and when you get to the end point, you kind of feel a bit empty that we didn't get a fully rounded, resolute ending and compositive, if you like, comprehensive breakdown of the Clone Wars mythology, where we saw what happened to everybody and where they got up to. Now, again, I completely understand that going into Revenge of the Sith, we couldn't touch base again with Anakin and Obi-Wan. I've mentioned this throughout all my reviews of the final story arc. And that's another thing I want to highlight, that I think that it was actually a mistake when we look in hindsight to go too deep into Revenge of the Sith. I've mentioned before that looking at Clone Wars, I always felt that the ending of the series would kind of be at the beginning of Revenge of the Sith. So we would get a certain scene where we see Anakin and Obi-Wan mention the fact that Palpatine's been captured and that they have to fly off to go on another mission to help him, and then boom, that would be it. That would be the concluding end. And as viewers, who could say, this is right where the end of Clone Wars, and then we begin Revenge of the Sith. But they went full on into Revenge of the Sith, right? If we look at the Phantom Apprentice episode, and they mentioned that Anakin had killed Dooku, right? So we have very significant and pivotal events, right, that from a perspective of somebody watching the Clone Wars would be very excited. You'd want to see those events getting played out, but because they're Revenge of the Sith, those are events that are being talked about off screen. So again, I mentioned before, you're kind of getting shortchanged and discounted at having these hugely important events getting talked about and mentioned off screen, and that you're not getting the full weight of the experience. Again, if you're someone who hasn't indeed watched any of the original trilogy or the prequels or the sequel trilogy or Rebels. And as silly as it sounds, you are going to get people out there. Maybe if you're like more of a younger, newer generation, maybe of a generation who's recently bought Disney Plus, they weren't really Star Wars fans, but maybe they caught on to the hype surrounding this 4-part arc of the Clone Wars, and they've jumped into Clone Wars, right? So they would be watching that series, and I imagine they would have done a few catch up of previous seasons as well, but they would have been disappointed that they didn't catch up more with Anakin, particularly if Anakin turned out to be one of their favourite characters, same as Obi-Wan or same as Mace Windu, right? So I think that was a mistake as well, that they went too far into Revenge of the Sith, because what happened was it boxed them into a corner, eliminating all of these pivotal characters that they couldn't go back to, so they had to centralise the story on Rex and Ahsoka. And particularly with Ahsoka, another issue as well is that we already had a 4-part arc with the Martez sisters that got dragged out. And if we look at the final arc and the way it played out, Ahsoka really was the central character. She was the one who faced off against Maul. She was the one who helped Bo-Katan. She was the one who freed Rex of his inhibitor control. She was the one that was kind of in the last and final scenes. Now, don't get me wrong, Ahsoka has been a very compelling character, and she, unlike Rey, has had that overall progression and development alike. And I know there's an ongoing debate, why are people against Rey, but they're very much favoured towards Ahsoka. And I've seen a couple of great YouTube videos focus on this debate, and it's down to kind of character development, and that's why Ahsoka was able to get pushed at the forefront of this final arc, and it made more sense. It didn't feel more forced, only really until this final arc, where I felt it was too much weighted on Ahsoka. And again, this was a result of the fact that we went so far into Revenge of the Sith that we couldn't concentrate on other characters. So Ahsoka was kind of the most long-standing character within this series, along with Rex. Okay, so that's why the writers were forced, in my opinion, by this mistake of going into Revenge of the Sith, of having to concentrate fully on Ahsoka. Okay, I don't think there was anything to do with wokeness here or feminist angles here. I just think it just put themselves into a corner by going too much into Revenge of the Sith, and I think that's what hurt the series. If you think about, let's say if they didn't go too much into Revenge of the Sith, how different would the series have played that? How much more involved would the Siege of Mandalore been had we been able to kind of focus a bit more on Anakin and Obi-Wan? Again, we go back, if we hadn't wasted so many episodes with the Martez sisters, or maybe had 2-3 episodes with the Bad Batch, so the Bad Batch ended up being a 2-parter, and we had 2 more episodes, okay? How much more development could we have got to give that much more of a compositive perspective of the Clone Wars mythology, and the Clone Wars world, and how everything was affected following the final events of Order 66. We've had a much more time to give a much more of a resolute ending and impactful ending, in my opinion, on here. So that was really the main flaws, I think, of the overall season. I just wanted to mention quickly again the use of Vader, and I'll comment on this in the finale review, that we have to question, as much as Vader is the iconic character, yes, and obviously everybody loves seeing Vader in any kind of screen capacity, is he being used more gimmick? I mentioned before in Rogue One, again, did we need to see Vader in Rogue One? We had that great scene on here, but it kind of felt just thrown in. Again, in Rebels, did we really need to see him in Rebels? Although it's very good, as we all know, he has a fight later on with Ahsoka. But again, did we need to see Vader there? Did we really need to jump forward and see Vader in the Clone Wars? Because as we all know, Clone Wars is before the development of what happens with Anakin and how he transforms into Vader. So the Vader scene, as good as it was at the end, it kind of just felt forced in. A fan service moment, a good moment, very well displayed on the screen, but a fan service moment that again just felt a bit unwarranted. I would have preferred a montage rather of seeing all the characters involved with the series, or I would have preferred actually a moment with Obi-Wan. If we jump forward and maybe we see Ahsoka touch base with Obi-Wan as he starts to begin to learn how to connect with Qui-Gon, as we all know at the end of Revenge of the Sith. Yoda's going to show Obi-Wan how to connect with people who have passed. And also, as we know, Obi-Wan had started to look over Luke and review his upbringing. So maybe we could have had a scene in between then when Obi-Wan touches base with Rex or touches base with Ahsoka, and then we kind of get a full summarization of what's going on. We could have had a very emotional moment when Obi-Wan wants to tell Ahsoka what happened with Anakin, but then he refrains from doing it at the last scene, and that could have again would have had a much more of an emotional, impactful feel to it, rather than just jumping forward and just seeing Vader at the end. Regardless of how sincere and how well put together that moment was, I just feel we just needed a bit more of the ending of Clone Wars. You know, I've mentioned before that we could have actually dealt with a couple of more episodes, and the way this was panning out this series, I actually thought they were going to announce that we were going to get maybe a shortened season 8 when we had the May the 4th celebrations, but that didn't turn out. I also mentioned that maybe we could do with maybe a 60 to 90 minute companion piece, just a final animated movie, Clone Wars, or just post Clone Wars, just to show again what happened to the other characters and just kind of just cap off the events what we had on here. But I don't think we'll get that in the future. It is looking now that this is the kind of complete end of the series itself on here. So I think season overall was very good. If I had to give it a rating, I would give it an 8.1 out of 10. As I said, stunningly visuals, animation, action, set pieces, music, all on a thrilling cinematic level. The 4-part season of Mandalore arc is some of the best Star Wars we've had within the last 5 or 6 years. The Bad Batch as well was a terrific, exciting story arc. But overall, what plagued the season was that prolonged story arc. We wasted a couple of episodes. If you think about it, if you take off 2 episodes of the Bad Batch, take off, I would say, 3 episodes away from the Martez sisters, that gives you 5 more episodes where you could have maximised the impact of the storytelling and really given us a more complete end of the show. I imagine if you had that, if you had those episodes compiled together for more impactful story arcs, then this season could have ended up being a 9 out of 10 or possibly even a 10 out of 10. But as a result of those wasted episodes beforehand, it's ended up for me being an 8.1 out of 10, which is still a very exceptionally high score for a season. Very good season. I wouldn't say this is the best season overall. I think their season 3, season 4, maybe season 5 had a much more of a consistency throughout, but I will talk about that more when I do an overall series review of Clone Wars. And as I've mentioned before, I will do a countdown of what I think are overall the best episodes of the entire seasons. But that's my view for now on Star Wars The Clone Wars season 7 overall review. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Did you think it was the best season overall? As I mentioned before, a lot of people have remarked that it was the best amongst all Star Wars. Do you agree with that sentiment, or do you feel that there have been other content earlier on within Star Wars that's still superior or just as good as what we saw in this season below? So thanks for sitting through this very long review. I know my reviews, I'll try and be more concise in the future, but as I mentioned, there will be a greatest episodes of the Clone Wars coming along with a series review as well. So those are my thoughts for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.